hoping England can make it out of the group stages. Please, England, make it out of the group stages.
Good morning to you. In politics, this is quite a weekend. A massive march in London against Brexit and a smaller one in favour. Two huge companies, Airbus and BMW, threatening to up sticks, and because of that, growing fears among Brexiteers. We're now heading for a half-in, half-out, fudged and unconvincing exit. Exactly 2 years ago, just after that referendum result had come in, the country seemed bitterly divided. It still is. After Theresa May's £20 billion NHS announcement, paid for by what? I'm joined by the Health Secretary, Jeremy Hunt. And just ahead of a crunch NATO summit, I'll be talking to the Shadow Defence Secretary, Labour's Neil Griffith. Plus, later on, the strange tale of the tennis hero, his bankruptcy and a disputed passport from the Central African Republic. And I've been talking about strong men and popular democracy with best-selling author Robert Harris. Reviewing the news this morning, the Brexit-supporting political editor of the Sunday Express, Camilla Tominey, and the not Brexit-supporting Guardian columnist, Gabby Hinsliff. All of that coming up. But first, the headlines with Ben Thompson.
Andrew, thank you. Good morning. The government has announced new plans to halve childhood obesity in England by 2030. Proposals include a ban on selling energy drinks to children, restrictions on junk food advertising, more calorie labelling and limits on supermarket promotions. Campaigners praise the measures as bold and ambitious, but Labour's Shadow Health Secretary John Ashworth has criticised the plan as a watered-down strategy. One of Britain's main rail lines has returned to public ownership this morning. The government took over the former East Coast Main Line after the failure of the franchise operated by Virgin Trains. The first service, operated by the new North London Eastern Railway, left Newcastle for London earlier this morning. Women in Saudi Arabia have begun enjoying their new freedom to drive after the kingdom lifted its controversial ban, the last country in the world to do so. The ban was lifted last night after campaigning by human rights groups. The reform is part of Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman's programme to modernise some aspects of Saudi society. But critics point out that many women activists who campaigned for the ban were arrested and remain in prison. President Trump has defended his tough stance on immigration at a rally in Las Vegas. The president was forced to change policy on separating parents and children of migrant families after widespread criticism. But he said he would continue with overall reforms, describing US immigration law as a laughingstock.
We're being very, very tough at the border. In fact, until just recently, we had a 70-year low coming through. And by the way, we want people to come into our country, but we want them to come in for merit, through merit. We want a merit-based system so they can help us.
And finally, England fans are gathering in the Russian city of Nizhny Novgorod to watch today's World Cup match against Panama. England, the clear favourites, will progress to the knockout stages if they win this afternoon. Panama has never played at a World Cup before, but the England manager Gareth Southgate insists his team is not complacent. You can watch the match on BBC One. Kick-off is at 1 o'clock. And that's all from me for now. The next news on BBC One is at 12 o'clock today. Andrew, back to you.
Many thanks, and not a great deal of mansplaining on this programme about the football. The headlines, as ever, the Observer has gone with that huge anti-Brexit march. And from a different perspective, Camilla's got a story here, no deal, no cash. That's another group of people writing to the papers saying that Theresa May must hang really tough and ensure that the Brussels side understands that if they don't give us a deal, they'll get not a penny of our money. There's the Sun with a story I don't understand. There's the Sunday Times with a story I do understand, I think. It's a very, very serious story. This is one of the big stories of the day, which is there are pumps which are used to put opiates, that's drugs, into people at a certain rate. and some of them seem to be failing, and it is possible that people have been killed up and down the country by these pumps. This is as a result of the Gosport investigation. A whistleblower has come to the Sunday Times. We'll be talking about that story, I'm sure, later on. The Sunday Telegraph has a story about housing and the lack of housing, and inside the effect of not enough homeowners on Conservative constituencies electorally at the next election. And then finally, an extraordinary story here, really. The Mail on Sunday. Give me £20 billion or I'll bring you down, says Gavin Williamson, the Defence Secretary, to Theresa May. And if you think that's going at something, you should read the language inside. It's an act of extraordinary and rare cabinet insubordination, if it's true. So let's start with Gabby. Is it true, do you think, Gabby?
I think it is either gospel truth or it is a version of the truth that the Defence Secretary would like out there. Because the story is about a meeting between Defence Secretary and Chiefs of Staff or senior military officers in which he promises them, I'll get you the kind of money that Jeremy Hunt got for health. And they say, well, are you sure you've got the PM on side? And he says, I made her, I can break her.
I made her, I can break her.
Sounds like a line from a film. Because, of course, he was ran her leadership campaign. Now, you would normally expect to be invited in for sort of an interview without coffee after this sort of story was briefed, if not summarily sacked, if this was sort of normal times. But as we all know, they're not normal times. Theresa May can't afford to do that.
Do we think that cabinet discipline is now breaking down quite badly? Because you've got Boris Johnson saying F business when it comes to Brexit, which again is an extraordinary thing to be saying. We've got this very, very aggressive leaking by somebody to the Mail on Sunday.
I think it broke down some time ago. I think there's a strong feeling that Theresa May isn't going to be around for much longer once the Brexit deal is done or not done, whatever happens. And therefore people are sort of parking their tanks, quite literally in this case, on her lawn. But I think there's a second thing here, which is that Gavin Williamson made his pitch for credibility to the department, which it's fair to say has some degree of scepticism about him as Defence Secretary on the grounds that, I'll get you more money. Now the Chancellor's saying, well, all the money's gone to the NHS, there is no more money. I think he's in an awkward position, and this kind of tough talking is slightly covering for that. You notice Liz Truss in the Sunday Telegraph as well today saying it's not macho to ask for more money. The really tough thing is to manage with the money you've got. Who could she possibly be talking about?
No idea who she's talking. I don't know how much a World Cup ticket would cost. I would pay the equivalent amount of money to be sitting as a fly in the wall the next time that Theresa May and Gavin Williamson sit down together.
Can you imagine?
Extraordinary.
Yeah.
Indeed.
Come on, let's turn to the Sunday Times story. We have to explain this a bit, don't we?
Yes. So the Gosport report obviously came out listing categoric and awful failures with regard to a number of people dying. The Sunday Times has now spoken to a whistleblower who is suggesting that there is a problem with the syringes that were used at that hospital and could have been used at others up until, I believe, 2015. Now, there are two types of syringes that disperse into the body opiates like diamorphine. And
to be absolutely clear, this is so that nurses and doctors don't have to come in hour after hour giving little injections. They pump the stuff into the body.
Time-saving, and so anyone who's had a relative or been in hospital is familiar with having a cannula in and having it fixed to a syringe that slowly pumps out the correct amount of drugs. Now, concerns were raised internally some years ago that two syringes, one which pumped drugs very slowly and one which pumped a great amount of drugs very quickly, were easily confused. So much so that some hospitals took their own action and put fluorescent stickers on different syringes to make sure there was no confusion. Now, we all know how busy and sometimes understaffed emergency wards are. Staff could have been overtired, confused, under pressure and mixed up syringes. Now, the report itself dismissed any concerns about the syringes, saying this isn't something that's on our radar, this isn't something that we think is significant. However, Jane Barton, the doctor at the centre of this whole scandal, was asked repeatedly in her police investigation about the syringes and her use of them.
No comment.
But it means that it was on the police's radar at the time, and the whistleblower suggesting the reason why the syringes didn't form a major part of that Gosport investigation is because it could obviously open the floodgates to a massive NHS cover-up.
And if people are thinking this sounds a little bit obscure, a little bit detailed, we should refer to the Sunday Times front page headline, which says that this might have killed thousands of people up and down the country. There are 40,000 of these syringes being used now inside the NHS. And if it's true, then this is the biggest NHS cover-up ever, possibly.
What's interesting in the coverage as well is the suggestion that countries like New Zealand and Australia banned use of the syringes in the noughties. The NHS said we really need to phase these out and invited hospitals to stop using them, I think, in 2010 for a period of 5 years. But there wasn't an official recall. So, yes, there is a suggestion they're still in operation. And actually, the NHS uses these syringes more than any other health service in the world.
It's a really big story I'll talk to Jeremy Hunt about, obviously, later on. Now, I said at the beginning of the show that this was a divided country. But after Trump, America is a divided country too. You've got a story from the tablet there, Gabby.
Yes, this is a tweet from Sarah Huckabee Sanders, the White House press secretary, who tweeted last night. Last night I was told by the owner of Red Hen in Lexington, Virginia, which is a restaurant, for those of you who don't live in Lexington, to leave because I work for the president, and I politely left. Her actions say far more about her than about me. So what you've got here really is, apparently the backstory is that the owner of the restaurant, when Sarah Sanders came in, said to her staff, do you want to serve this person? A lot of her staff are immigrants, obviously very angry about the scenes that we've seen on the border with Mexico, the policy of separating children from their families. And the staff basically said, no, we don't. You know, we'd like to make a personal stand here. And it's that moment, I think, that happens when things become personal and your private life as well as your public life becomes full of people criticising you. That sense that, you know, public sentiment is turning against you in very meaningful ways.
Camilla, can I turn to another aspect of the health stories that are out there today?
Sure.
Very important story, which is this childhood obesity campaign. It's no one, you know, denies that this is a really, really big issue. The question is, how do you deal with it?
Well, this was the main government drop into the Sunday papers. Everybody's run it, and everyone's run it in different ways. The top lines of the story are essentially that the government is considering a number of measures to halve childhood obesity by 2030. They include banning the sale of energy drinks to children, stopping 2-for-1 bog-off deals on junk food, stopping TV advertisers from loading lots of junk food adverts into primetime TV. At the moment, children can't be advertised to during their own viewing in the morning, but actually the 8 and 9 o'clock shows are still full of adverts for pizzas and sweets and chocolates.
And there's a suggestion of putting calorie counting on all restaurant menus. I wonder if that is kind of burger vans and pie vans.
It's apparently all cafes and restaurants and takeaways, so that's also significant in order to give parents more choice. And the other thing that I think will be music to mothers and fathers' ears at the checkout, this taking away of sweets and chocolates that we always encounter as soon as we go to pay. So all of these measures are under consideration. Personally speaking, I think this is good news because there is this sense that as well, there needs to be an onus on companies, on retailers, to not load so much secret sugar into goods that sometimes we associate with being healthy. For instance, children are fed lots of yogurts, and at the same time, we discover later that they've got as much sugar in them as ice cream.
I think what we're going to see is the usual argument that we always have over public health measures, which is it government's role to intervene, or is it for parents to do more to police their children's diet? But I think this is recognising that not all parents, that's lovely if parents do, not all parents do, and you know, their kids are the ones who are at risk.
The Daily Mile initiative that's been suggested, which is to get school children to do a mile a day, either by walking or cycling to school, but equally getting exercise. Funnily enough, my children's school, their state school in Hertfordshire, they do the Daily Mile, and it's had huge results on health and fitness. There's a school in Scotland, apparently, that's absolutely transformed the health of the children there. And it's very simple. They just do a mile around the playground with Fitbits.
Very good. OK, let's turn to the big march yesterday.
Indeed.
Most of the papers say 100,000 people at least. That seems to be agreed by everybody. Very big. Not many senior Labour Party people addressing this march, to say the least, Gabby.
Funnily enough, yes. Apparently there was a great cry from the crowd of "Where's Jeremy Corbyn?" to the tune of "Oh, Jeremy Corbyn," the chant that we always hear for the Labour leader. So it's one of those rare things, which is a protest march is slightly more embarrassing for the opposition than the government, in that obviously they're marching against Brexit, marching for a second referendum, marching for a say on the deal. But there was a great sense of frustration. I know. But what else do you call a public vote that's not a referendum? That's part of the problem with the campaign, is that it's a confused ask. But I think what you're looking at here is a sense of huge frustration, both with Brexit, but in large parts of the crowd, frustration with the Labour Party that it's not doing more to stop a watered down
I like that
Brexit.
little poster we just saw. I'm British, I'm marching, things must be bad.
Yes.
There's a lot of wit in that. Now, as I say, alongside that, there's an unprecedented letter from all the major business and industry bodies to the Prime Minister saying, basically, get on with Brexit. We're really, really panicking now.
I think that's a real expression of they were prepared to trust government for a while to sort it out. Now they feel that time is running out, and a debate that has been had in private very much, between business leaders and government is coming out into the public arena. It's hard for companies to go private saying, we might pull out, because that has an impact on their staff morale, it has an impact on public perception. But I think people are now starting to get really worried that the government can't deliver what it said it would deliver.
Absolutely. Now, Camilla, you had a different letter from different business leaders.
We have the usual suspects on the Remain side and then the usual suspects on the Brexiteer side, sending a letter to Theresa May basically saying, look, get tough with Brussels, tell them if there's no deal, there'll be no cash and you're not getting your 39 billion divorce settlement. What I find interesting about both letters is shouldn't they rather be sent to the EU? Because if there is this sense that everyone wants the same thing and that there's a deal there to be struck...
The business letter did go to the EU as well,
Well, the business letter should go to the EU because a lot of people will be looking at the negotiations thinking that Barnier, Tusk and Juncker have all been digging in their heels and aren't helping the process.
We haven't had much time to go abroad and look at events abroad, but of course a lot of people are very, very concerned about the result later on today, and I'm talking, of course, about the first round of the Turkish elections. Will Mr Erdogan have to face a recount, a second round and so forth? That is the big story, I think, today. Is that right?
Yeah, apparently there's some sort of sporting event. I'm not sure what, though.
Yeah, somebody mentioned something about football.
We'll hear something more about that later on, possibly. Thank you both very much indeed. Back in the mid-1980s, Boris Becker was the Grand Slam-winning global poster boy for tennis. He was a German, much adored in Britain. But since then, so much has gone wrong in his life: divorce, paternity scandal, financial turmoil, all culminating in an angry bankruptcy fight and a bizarre row over his work for one of the most troubled of the world's nations, the Central African Republic. A little earlier in this week, he came into the studio and he talked to me. Boris Becker, let's start with the basics. Are you bankrupt?
I'm going through a personal bankruptcy for the last 12 months. I owe an English private bank 3.9 million euros. I've given the trustee in excess of 5 million euros a while ago. So, to my knowledge, this case should be closed.
And is this the only big debt you have? Because people have talked about £54 million owing.
When you mention the name Boris Becker, people lose their reality or their sense of facts and they start imagining things that's absolutely not true.
So how much money now do you owe?
Well, I've paid it. My debt was...
So you owe no money at all?
That's why I don't understand the confusion. I've given the trustee the courts the conviction. Well, the conviction was 3.9 euros. I've given that money. Money is there, and so I don't understand why we're having these discussions.
So anybody who actually is owed money by Boris Becker, any creditor, will be paid?
Absolutely.
How did this come about? Because you have been a very, very wealthy man since you were 17. How did you get into a position where you owed so much money? What was the money for?
No, well, it was a business deal that I was offered many years ago when I came to the United Kingdom. I was living in Switzerland, and a very famous bank said you could possibly have done it before. You could sell your brand rights out of another country to an English bank, tax-free, and they would give you the money, and you have 5 years to pay them off.
And it didn't work out?
Well, it worked out good for 3. Then, unfortunately, a couple of contracts didn't continue. New ones weren't coming, so they had a problem.
Do you think you've been a bit financially irresponsible or at least naive?
I've been fortunate enough for the last 33 years to make a lot of money. I made my first million at 17 years old, winning at SW19. I've been blessed. I come from a good family background, so money was never the incentive and never the issue. I think there were different problems that came along.
In the middle of all of this, rather surprisingly, you suddenly became a diplomat working for the Central African Republic. How did that come about?
Well, I was approached by the President, His Excellency Mr. Touareg, already in February to help him improve the image, the reputation of this very difficult and poor country. And so in the ceremony in April, he made me the attaché for sports, culture and humanitarian affairs. And that has nothing to do with my bankruptcy proceedings. It was just informing the trustee and therefore the courts that if they want to send me to another hearing, my official address is the embassy in Brussels and not at Wimbledon or in Germany. Unfortunately, the other side didn't played stumm. They didn't respond to that, and therefore we have these misunderstandings.
And this all came about through the Belgian side of the Central African Republic. It's been suggested that German politicians were the go-betweens in all of that. Was this true?
The connection was made from German politicians. The reason for it is I'm a son of a refugee. My family is all mixed race, so I have a strong feeling towards the African continent, and therefore have a lot of respect and seriousness within. So this was the story behind it. Something I continue to do for many, many more years.
Can I ask who the politicians were who were the in-between figures?
I'm not throwing around with names. You know, they're not sitting on the couch.
But they were Alternative für Deutschland politicians.
Well, they were actually friends of mine. They were not necessarily professionals. They were friends of mine that I know for many, many years. That's how this relationship came about.
Have you ever been to the Central African Republic?
I haven't been yet. I've been very busy with my tennis engagement the last few weeks, but the invitation stands, and whenever I have a week free, I'd love to visit the country.
So, for those people who haven't been and wonder what it's like, can I read you what Amnesty International says about the Central African Republic? The government, it says, has minimal control outside the capital. It goes on, widespread impunity fuels instability and conflict. Armed groups were responsible for killings, torture, sexual assaults, abductions, arrests, extortion, looting, the exploitation of children and attacks on humanitarian workers. Many suspected perpetrators of human rights abuses and violations, including armed groups and security forces, were not investigated or tried. What is it about that country that so appeals to you?
They have a very, very disturbing past. That's correct. The president was elected in democratic elections. He has studied math at the university in Paris. He's a very honorable man. He wants to change the country. It's a difficult one. It's very poor. They have a lot of internal fights with various parts. That's correct.
So what have you done in this role so far?
Well, I don't think anybody has spoken about the Republic of Central Africa as much as if they have done the last 4 and 6 weeks, and have pointed out, as you have, about the difficulties and the turmoil that has within.
How many meetings have you had in this job so far?
I've met the president on 3 or 4 occasions. I've met the ambassador on many occasions. I've spoken to the people on many, many occasions, and now we're about to go ahead.
The reason I'm asking this, and you've referred to it already, is that many people think you are using this, perhaps cynically, as a way to get out of the bankruptcy proceedings, claiming diplomatic immunity, as you now can.
That's correct, but one has nothing to do from the other. I'm not running away from my debt. I'm just informing the trustee and the courts about my position, as I legally have to do.
But you yourself have said the decision to commence bankruptcy proceedings against me was both unjustified and unjust. I have now asserted diplomatic immunity, as I'm in fact bound to do, in order to bring this farce to an end, so I can start to rebuild my life. So you yourself have connected the two things.
I have to inform about my official position. When I receive court documents, they have to get to the right address. I have informed the other side already weeks ago about this position, and it's just a fact. And
it's very convenient, isn't it?
And being a diplomat has its ups and has its downsides. I just want to be correct, and I want to inform who I am today.
Do you have a Central African Republic passport?
Yes, I have.
Because the foreign minister has told the BBC that this is a forgery.
I don't know what's internally happening within the politics of the Republic of Central Africa, but I have received this passport from the ambassador. I've spoken to the president on many occasions. It was an official inauguration. I believe the documents they're giving me must be right.
Well, the foreign minister, whose signature is supposed to be on it, doesn't recognise his own signature. This could all be cleared up because they want you to go back to the Central African Republic and be extradited there. Would you go if you were asked to go?
I'm very happy anytime soon to visit Bangui, the capital, and to speak to the people personally about how we can move forward and how we can resolve this misunderstanding and this confusion.
But as far as you're concerned, you have got a real passport.
I have a real passport. It's at the embassy in Brussels the last time I checked.
This is all a rather sad, sorry and murky business. I can remember in 1985 watching you on the court at Wimbledon, and like many people across the United Kingdom, we all kind of took you to our hearts. There was Boris Becker mania. How has it come to this?
That was 33 years ago, and we all have moved on. I'm very happy with my life today. I've become involved in politics. The African continent is close to my heart. I realized all the problems they're facing because my own family had some of the same issues and some of the same problems. I experienced racism. I experienced these type of problems, and I want to make a change. Me as a very German-looking man, it's something that's very close to my heart.
Nonetheless, what we've been talking about, it's a bit sort of distasteful and so forth. What has gone wrong in your life? I mean, as you say, you were a millionaire at 17. Did you simply have too much money too early in your life to know how to handle it?
Again, I think...
Or to handle life, even.
I think there were a lot of, unfortunately, thank you very much for the opportunity to speak out here a little bit. There were many stories that were not true. Just people lose their imagination when they hear Boris Becker. I do live a pretty exciting life. But, 17 years, was young. I was very successful then. I believe I'm successful now.
And to be absolutely clear, you will be at Wimbledon commentating.
Very proudly with my German English. Hopefully everybody understands me. I think they do. It's been a part of my life. I live in Wimbledon and I've been part of the tournament for, 35 years now.
Boris Becker. Now, we spoke to the private bank who are involved in that bankruptcy case, Arbuthnot Latham, who reject Mr Becker's version of events, and they say they're still owed a significant sum. We also spoke to the trustees, Mr Becker mentions, who say further sums need to be paid. And so to the weather. Hot this weekend. You could almost fry an egg on the pavements of London, though it tends to make them slightly gritty underneath. And we're promised even hotter this week. Scorching, almost un-British weather. Over to Sarah Keith-Lucas in the Weather Centre. Sarah.
Well, Andrew, you've summed it up nicely there. We've got some beautiful weather on the cards. If you like things hot, sunny and dry, not everybody does. Things are certainly going to be warming up through much of the week ahead, and it is a fine day out there today. This is the view in Porthing, Cornwall. You can see the cirrus cloud around. Actually, many parts of the country have got quite a bit of high cloud drifting around, so it's not wall-to-wall blue skies, but it's this area of high pressure that is keeping the weather dry and settled today and through much of the week ahead too. A bit more cloud just lapping on shore to parts of eastern England and eastern Scotland, and we've got that veil of high cloud turning things a little bit hazy, particularly in the south. Much more sunshine across central Scotland and Northern Ireland than we saw yesterday, and with lighter winds too, it is a little bit warmer. So temperatures ranging between around about 21 to 27 for most of us, just a little cooler for the far north of Scotland. We've got some late sunshine this evening and then dry conditions once again overnight. Not particularly hot and muggy overnight. In fact, temperatures just about getting down into single figures in the countryside first thing Monday. Monday shaping up to be another largely fine and dry day. Lots of sunshine, similar to what we've seen out there today. Again, just a light breeze, a bit more cloud in the far northwest, but by Monday afternoon, we could see those temperatures in a few spots as high as 30 degrees. Andrew.
Which is officially, for me at least, too hot. Now, yesterday, Jeremy Corbyn said he wanted a new approach to international affairs. Less bombing, more talking. Donald Trump, meanwhile, ahead of the NATO summit, says he wants Britain to contribute more on defence spending. So there are big choices ahead for Labour. And I'm joined now by the Shadow Defence Secretary, Neil Griffith. Welcome, Neil Griffith. Can I start by asking you whether you want Britain to stay as a Tier 1 military power?
Well, absolutely. And the whole point is that what Jeremy is saying is that we need to be out there showing really positive leadership in the world. And that means taking a full part in the UN, and that includes the UN Security Council. But we need to use that as a force for good.
The reason I ask that is that the Prime Minister has asked the question as to whether we should stay as a Tier 1 military power, which for people watching means that we are able to deploy sea, on land and in the air, and nuclear forces anywhere in the world at any time. But Labour would like that to continue. Well,
absolutely. And I think the whole issue about the Prime Minister questioning that, of course, is linked into the whole question about defence spending under the Tory government. And we can see the tantrums that we're having now from the Defence Secretary about that, and yet not a penny extra has actually been given to our armed forces. So we have armed forces personnel. We're celebrating Armed Forces Personnel Week this week, and yet they've not seen a penny more in their pay packets in spite of all the promises.
To be clear, do you think that we have enough aircraft, enough tanks, enough warships to protect ourselves properly as we leave the EU?
Well, we're in the middle of a modernising defence programme review. We shall look at that very carefully, see what the threats they are, identify, and see how the government plans to deal with those threats. But the fact of the matter is that this government has cut 10 billion off the defence budget since 2010, and they are scarcely making the 2%. Now, we in Labour are fully committed to the 2% of GDP, which is the NATO commitment which is expected of us. And if you look at our record in government, Andrew, all the time, we consistently spent more than 2% of our GDP on defence.
If you talk to people now, including on the Defence Select Committee, voices in the Conservative Party, voices in the military and voices in the opposition parties too, a lot of people say 2% is no longer enough. We need to go nearer 3%. Would Labour commit to doing more than 2%?
Well, I think the point is that the government at the moment is actually...
but I'm asking you about you.
Well, let me just explain. Barely scraping 1.9% of GDP, and that's by the Treasury's own figures. And we also
NATO says that we've hit 2%.
That, well, the point being that you are allowed by NATO rules to include things like MOD pensions, but we never did include things like that which don't actually contribute to the defence of this country. So what we've been saying, and this was in our manifesto last year very clearly, was that we would have a proper 2% and that we fully match the government's current spending plans for defence.
So Gavin Williamson says he needs an extra £2 billion a year. Would Labour commit to that kind of sum or not?
Well, I think the point is we want to see the results. Now, we don't know for 1 minute whether he's actually going to get that money. We also, as I say, we're in the middle of this modernising defence programme review. But what I can tell you is that when we make promises about money, we know where we're going to fund them from, and we stick to our manifesto commitments. Not like the stuff we've seen this week about NHS funding and now this mythical funding, which we don't know where it would come from.
But you can't tell me now that you would match what Gavin Williamson says he needs to protect this country.
But what I can tell you is that we consistently spent more than 2%. That's our record in government. And that when we talked about a pay rise for the armed forces in our manifesto last summer, we fully showed where that would come from, which stream of taxation that would actually come from. So any defence committed spending that we commit to will be fully funded. And I'm going to talk about some today, if I may, and some funding that we're going to
We'll come on to that in a minute. Jeremy Corbyn, your leader, had a good election, but there was one moment when he seemed to be a little bit on the defensive and in some trouble, which was when he was asked to defend the policy of carrying on with the Trident submarine fleet, which he doesn't believe in. He doesn't believe in using nuclear weapons to threaten other countries. You do. If he came to you and said, look, Neil, I can find the money for the extra tanks, I can find the money for the extra aircraft carriers and aircraft to go on them, and all of that, but let's do a deal, just drop your support for Trident, what do you say to him?
Well, I say that it's Labour Party policy that we keep Trident, that the decisions have been taken, the work is being undertaken, and that is not a decision that we are going back on. So we're very, very clear that having the nuclear deterrent is a very important part of our defence policy. It's also an important part of being a Tier 1 nation and being in the UN Security Council.
But very, very recently, back in 2015, you said up and down the country, even in some military circles, people are questioning the enormous expenditure on Trident, whether it really provides value for money or offers the protection we need. And you said you cannot combat horrific terrorist groups living amongst innocent civilians with a nuclear missile. You were against Trident back then. What's changed your mind?
Well, I think if you look at the world today, it's a more uncertain place than it's ever been. And I think if you look at the way that the United States is not stepping up to the mark, I don't think this is the right time to be getting rid of our nuclear deterrent. Of course, we need to keep an eye on costs. Of course, we need to make sure that we get value for money. And it is a challenging situation when it's a single source purchase, much more difficult than when you have competition. But at the end of the day, this is not the time to be descaling our nuclear deterrent.
Let's ask about some specific issues of confronting the country at the moment. President Trump wants to send more troops to Afghanistan because the Taliban are again on the rise. Would Labour support that?
Well, I think the important thing is that we work through the UN.
No, would Labour support that or not?
Well, what I'm saying is we work through the UN and we work with our NATO allies and we base the decisions on the intelligence that's coming back.
All of those are true, but they're not an answer to my question. Would Labour support putting more troops into Afghanistan?
We certainly support the idea that you cannot abandon... give me half a minute. You cannot abandon a process halfway through. Now, we know that it's not going to take just 1 year or 2 years. It's going to be 20, 30 years for the government of Afghanistan to become as stable and you know, as democratic and stable as we would like. So it will take longer. And if we have the expertise that we can offer, then certainly we're willing to put that in.
So you would support putting more British troops into Afghanistan? You
absolutely.
Would? OK, can I talk about the Syrian border? Your leader, Jeremy Corbyn's been in Syria recently on the border, and he suggested that we should no longer stand shoulder to shoulder with the Americans and we should pull back from that part of the world where so many other countries are intervening. Does that mean that Labour is against any further RAF bombing in Syria?
Well, what we've said very, very clearly is that we need to restart a peace process. And Jeremy's been very clear about this, that you have to keep on and keep on and keep on, no matter how many setbacks you have in the diplomatic process, in order to actually broker a peace. Because whilst we have a situation where at any moment violence can erupt and conflicts can escalate, it doesn't help the situation if you do not restart that peace process. And that's what we need to be doing. OK. A lot of people wonder who is really in charge of Labour's defence policy, you or Jeremy Corbyn. Jeremy Corbyn has been highly critical of NATO for a very long time. Donald Trump is against NATO in some respects, certainly in terms of its spending. Are you completely committed to Britain's continued membership of NATO? Well, absolutely. And it was a Labour government who actually were founding a part of NATO. And the important point is that we need to be a much more positive voice in NATO, a much more positive voice in the UN, so that we're actually shaping policy. And I mean, that's the issue. It's about taking that leadership role forward and actually shaping the way those organisations work. Now, in terms of positive voices and listening and all of that, huge march in London yesterday, 100,000 people chanting, "Where's Jeremy Corbyn?" No really big Labour people on the platform addressing that march. Is the Labour Party prepared to listen to that many people who want what they would call a people's vote, a second choice on the European Brexit matter, or are you closed to that? Well, first and foremost, as you know, Jeremy Corbyn was out in Jordan speaking about very, very important international issues. And the fact of the matter is, of course, people in a democratic country can do what they like and have marches, and that's good, and they should express their opinions. But you're not listening to them. But the important point is that we had a vote 2 years ago. The vote was for Brexit. So what we have said all along, absolutely consistently, is that we accept the result of that vote. But what we want is a Brexit that works the best way possible for the economy and for jobs. Okay. And what we're not getting from this government is any certainty. That's why you've got the likes of Airbus getting very upset. Their minds. OK. All right, Neil Griffiths, now thanks very much indeed for talking to us. Coming up later this morning, Sarah Smith and the Sunday Politics Show will be talking about the government's plans for the NHS with a man who represents hospital trusts right across England, and she'll be talking about yesterday's anti-Brexit march, as we just have been doing, and asking what it is they really want. That's the marchers. That's the Sunday Politics here at BBC One at 11 o'clock. Robert Harris is one of Britain's most successful novelists. His bestseller, The Ghost, was made into a film by Roman Polanski, and during production of that movie, Polanski was arrested for a historic sex offence from the 1970s. Back then, he had pleaded guilty to unlawful sex with a 13-year-old girl, and he fled the US. Earlier, I spoke to Robert Harris about that and about his trilogy of fine novels about ancient Rome, charting the rise and fall of the lawyer-politician Cicero in an age of demagogues and angry mobs. It has now been brought to the stage by the Royal Shakespeare Company.
Let's talk about power. Marcus Tullius Cicero, the greatest orator of his age, some say of any age. He faced powerful opposition from Catiline, brutal, ambitious, and from a young chancellor called Gaius Julius Caesar.
He rose because of the strength of his oratory and his voice and his cleverness. He was a brilliant defence lawyer. He was the sort of Clarence Darrow of his day, and he built up a political network that propelled him to the top. And he was consul for a year, and then, you know, as is often the case with politics, afterwards was nothing but grief and misery.
And so, in many ways, he represents the republican virtues of Roman democracy. He's on the side of the law and the constitution at a time when more and more strong men are rising and vying for power.
Yes, he was a great defender of the Roman constitution, and really the story of Cicero's life, and therefore of the novels and of the stage version, is a duel with Julius Caesar, who has a completely different conception of the state. For Cicero, a statesman who was like a family doctor, is how he described him, someone who, you know, can use all sorts of methods for the body politic to make it well. He said that Caesar never looked at politics like that. For him, it was all glory and what he could get out of it. And there are two completely different conceptions of a politician's role.
And of course, there's lots of parallels between Rome then and, I suppose, modern democracy now. But one big difference is the nature of the mob or the populace. In your novels and the stage play, the people are quite menacing, quite threatening. And when they turn nasty, they turn really nasty.
Yes, what is interesting, actually, and really has emerged since I finished the books, which took me 10 years in all to do, is that they are really about a beleaguered intellectual political elite being assailed by the people.
Liberal elite.
The liberal elite, of which Cicero was the greatest ornament, being assailed by the people, either led or manipulated by often extremely wealthy men, equivalent of billionaires, people like Caesar and Clodius.
Or, indeed, Putin or Erdogan, because we seem to be going through a period right at the moment when we're having a return of the strong men around the world.
Yes, that's it. And I think one of the things the books and the plays are about is democracy is not necessarily the natural state of political affairs. You know, you can see that the era of strong men is really, or women indeed, is now coming back, and it actually is the pattern of most of history, and it may be that we'll look back on a century and a half of democracy as an interlude, actually, and not something which we were promised was sort of here forever.
Now, I must ask you, because you've had a whole stream of novels, and you've covered Munich, and you've covered a lot of 20th century politics, and the Dreyfus affair as well. We hear the Dreyfus book is being made into a film, is that right?
Supposedly, yes. I mean, it's taken longer to make the film than Dreyfus was on Devil's Island, and it's... but I have hopes. If it is to be made, it will be made in French, I think, rather than English.
And Polanski, again, he did a very good job for you in the past, or is he somebody that you can't really work with anymore?
Well, it's extremely difficult. When I went to start collaborating with him, which was in 2007. Originally, we were going to make a film of Pompeii, one of my novels, and then when that fell through, I'd written this novel, The Ghost, and we made that instead.
Hello, who are you? I'm your ghost.
And at that time, nobody said to me, oh my God, you mustn't go and work with him. I mean, not a soul.
So, how do we go about this?
I interview you and turn your answers into prose.
Ready to start?
He would be having dinner with the French president, and he was travelling all over the world, and only to Britain and America could he not come. And, you know...
And then something in the culture
And then
changes.
the culture has completely changed. And so the question is, do you then say, OK, fine, I follow the culture, or do I say, well, he hasn't done anything since then. He won the Oscar, he got a standing ovation in Los Angeles. The zeitgeist has changed. Do you change with it? I don't know, to be honest with you.
So you
it's
haven't
not
chosen
something...
yet? You haven't made a decision yet?
Well, in practical terms, I wouldn't be making another film with him because he's getting very old and I don't really want to write a screenplay. Morally, I don't see why I should change my position because the fashion has changed.
And when it comes to novels, a lot of people will be watching this thinking, when is the next Robert Harris novel? When are you going, and what's it going to be about?
It will not be this year. It'll be next September, Deo Volente, as Cicero would have said. And it's a bit different. It's set in the future, several centuries in the future.
Robert Harris and science fiction, that's a new one.
Yes, well, I've set novels in an imaginary past that was an imaginary future, Fatherland, and I like playing around with time and ranging across different universes. So I'm trying something completely different. Really.
Well, we're all looking forward to it enormously. Robert Harris, thanks very much indeed for joining us.
Thanks, Andrew.
Thank you. Back in this universe, the Royal Shakespeare Company's production of Robert Harris's Cicero novels is at the Gielgud Theatre in London. Since Theresa May announced an extra £20 billion for the NHS in England, most of the comment has focused on where the money is going to come from. The Prime Minister said it would be partly from a Brexit dividend. Economists argue that that simply doesn't exist, but nor do we have any idea what taxes or borrowing might be used to fund the health service. Since this is the biggest single fiscal event outside a budget ever announced by a Tory government, this is a matter of some moment. And Jeremy Hunt, the Health Secretary, is now here. Welcome, Mr Hunt.
Good morning, Andrew.
Good morning. Can I ask you, first of all, how big is the Brexit dividend?
Well, I think the debate is about the impact on economic growth from Brexit, and that's why there is this debate, because the forecasts are different. What no one is doubting is that a £20 billion increase in the NHS budget is significant. And what Theresa May is saying, and I think this is very important on the basis of the interview that you did with her last Sunday, is something very simple, which is that almost exactly 2 years ago, the British people had a choice. Do they want their tax revenues to be paying for subscriptions to EU membership or on our vital public services like the NHS? And they said they wanted them to go to public services. And it is honouring that decision made by the British people that is why Theresa May said that part of the money for the NHS going forward will be those subscriptions that we won't be having to pay to Brussels.
It's the how much that I'm really asking you about today. Can I ask about the first year when this new money comes in, which is 2019-2020? In that year, how much Brexit dividend will there be?
Well, I don't think we will have very much Brexit dividend because in the first period after we leave the EU, we'll be paying a divorce bill, which will be substantial. But going forward, of course, we will have settled that. And Theresa May was very, very clear that there would be an impact on the taxes we all pay. We will find out what that impact is at the budget. Now, why are we not spelling that out now? Because these things, as you know, are always spelt out at budgets, but we needed to give the NHS 6 months to come up with a plan. And this is a conditional offer by the government. We've said if the NHS comes up with a plan over the next 6 months that meets our requirements in terms of stabilising performance, dealing with some long-standing issues.
You might not give them this money if the plan isn't good enough.
Well, I have to say I'm very confident that the NHS will come up with a good plan, but when we see that plan, they said to us, before we can do that plan, we need to know how much money's on the table, and that's what we've told them.
If Jeremy Corbyn came into this studio and said, I'm going to spend £20 billion extra on something, but I can't tell you how I'm raising it, he would be absolutely crucified. Now, as a government, you are currently doing the same thing. We have £20 billion. Where's it coming from? We don't know. We will tell you in due course.
Only for a period of months, because the NHS very specifically said to us, in order to do this 10-year plan, and I've been saying for a long time that we need to give the NHS stability, a long-term funding settlement so that they can make some of these really important changes that they need to make. They said, well, they need to know how much. So we're telling them how much we would be prepared, and we will tell the country exactly how we'll pay for it in the budget.
And you're still saying that some of this comes from a Brexit dividend. Can I read you what the Institute of Fiscal Studies says about this? You'll probably be familiar with it. There isn't a Brexit dividend, they say. If you look at the arrangement we've come to with the European Union in terms of paying our exit bill, and you add to that the commitment the government has already made to keep funding farmers and so on, there is literally arithmetically no money. In addition, we know the public finances will be worse as a result of the Brexit vote. The OBR, that's the official government body, has said by £15 billion a year, there really just isn't money there for a Brexit dividend.
Well, what the IFS agree with is that we won't be paying subscriptions to Brussels, but where there is disagreement is what the impact on economic growth would be. And all I would say is that a lot of those experts have been proved wrong in the past in their forecasts, and we actually think that the British economy can get through this very challenging period. But we don't know exactly when, and we don't know what the impact is, which is why we're being very clear that, yes, there will be an impact on the taxes people pay, and we will set that out in the budget.
Let me give you another expert forecaster who does agree with the IFS, said that the figure of the £350 million a week or the £100 million a week on the side of the bus, that figure. He said, it's not a figure we can bank on with any certainty because even if it did materialise after an exit from the EU, it would be negated by the very smallest of contractions in the economy.
Well, all I would say is...
Do you agree with that?
No, because I think you
said it.
You are focusing... No, I don't agree with the line of questioning, because you are focusing...
That's your own quote about the effects of leaving the EU on our finances.
And that's exactly what I said before you threw that quote at me, which is that there is uncertainty about the impact on the economy of Brexit. But the real point is that we have a Conservative Prime Minister who told you on this show last week that the burden of taxes would go up. And the central debate,
so
this is really important.
How much, though? That's what we want to know. Is the so-called Brexit dividend, is it 5% of the 20 billion, or half the 20 billion, or almost all the 20 billion? Is it mostly going to come from taxes or not? Those are very, very basic questions.
Andrew, you've been doing this show for a very long time to know that these things are announced in budgets. I've explained to you why we needed to announce what the overall amount for the NHS is, but I think we're missing the really important significance. I just want to say this. No, that's absolutely fine, and I'm not going to give up either, because you have a Conservative Prime Minister who has said that the burden of taxation will go up to fund the NHS. Now, the central debate in British politics over the last 20, 30 years has been framed as a choice. Do you want more money in public services, or do you want tax cuts? And what we as Conservatives...
You've always been the tax-cutting party, and now you're not.
No, what we as Conservatives have said is you can actually have both of those if and only if you take tough and difficult decisions on the economy, and those were the decisions taken by George Osborne in 2010, and after that Philip Hammond. And because those policies, which were opposed by Jeremy Corbyn, but the Labour movement, all sorts of people, but actually they created the 3.2 million jobs, which means we are now able to announce an 18% increase in the NHS budget, a significant increase.
And to do that, you have to say, honestly, income taxes are going to go up.
Well, we will say, honestly, exactly which taxes are going to go up, but those things, as you know, are always done in a budget.
Interesting you don't rule that out.
Well, we have to allow the Chancellor to do this in budgets. That's what always happens.
National insurance. Gordon Brown suggested a 1% rise in national insurance would do this.
Well, of course, I'm not going to speculate on that now, because what is important now for the NHS is that we have done what they asked, which is we've told them how much money the government will put on the table if we have a good NHS 10-year plan. We want the NHS to be the safest and best healthcare service in the world, and we want the country to know that if you take these difficult decisions to put the economy back on its feet, to create jobs, to create wealth, then in the end there is a dividend for public services, because as Conservatives we want to reduce the burden of taxation, but we also want to have the best public services.
Everyone wants cake and eat it. They want a better NHS, but they also don't want to pay extra taxes. They're really interested in what the answer to these questions is. You have said we will not break manifesto promises. You said that this week. So presumably the government is not going to raise VAT, for instance, to pay for the NHS, because that was a manifesto promise.
Well, of course we are committed to our manifesto, but what we also said in our manifesto is that we want our public services to be the best in the world, and that the NHS is the most important of all of those public services. And what we are doing now is honouring that manifesto pledge that recognises this. We have a once-in-a-lifetime change in the pressures in the NHS.
I understand that.
You have told me many, many times on this show, you've said we need...
I'm looking at the other side now, as you know, so...
Yeah, but you've told me many times on this programme that we don't have enough money going to the NHS. We accept that. We've listened to those arguments. We're putting that money in. We want to stabilise the NHS, but also... for people at home and people in the service who are passionate about the NHS, it's also very troublesome that our cancer survival rates aren't as good as France and Germany. We want to sort out those issues as well, and that's what we are now going to be in a position to do.
Can business people watching this programme be confident that by 2020 you're going to cut the business rate to 17%, as you promised, corporation tax to 17%, as you promised in the manifesto?
Well, what business people want is a sensible Conservative government, and they know that a sensible Conservative government does deliver the public services that the British people want. And, of course, don't forget, business people have relatives...
This is an astonishing moment, if I may say so.
Well,
a Conservative cabinet minister is not able to say that, having stood on a manifesto which promised corporation tax would come down to 17% by 2020, that you will honour that promise.
Well, I think what you're really astonished about is you spent most of your political life saying the Conservatives are underfunding the NHS, and Theresa May has just proved you wrong. She's put in £20 billion a year. That's a huge...
Huge amount of money. I'm just slightly interested in where it's coming from.
And she is someone who honours her promises. Well, you'll find that out, and you'll find that out within the next 6 months in the budget, and all will be revealed.
When you picked up the paper and you saw that Airbus is talking about leaving this country under certain circumstances, they don't get the right Brexit, what did you think?
Well, I just thought it's completely inappropriate for businesses to be making these kinds of threats for one very simple reason. We are in an absolutely critical moment in the Brexit discussions. And what that means is that we need to get behind Theresa May to deliver the best possible Brexit, a clean Brexit. And what businesses want, and I was in business for 14 years, what they want is clarity and certainty. And the more that we undermine Theresa May, the more likely we are to end up with a fudge, which will be an absolute disaster for everyone. And so I think she is very clear. Getting control of our borders, our laws, our money is what she wants to do.
It's not just Airbus, is it? It's not just Airbus. It's BMW, it's Siemens, and then all the business leaders writing to the papers today. Do you think this is all Project Fear Mark II?
Well, I don't think it's particularly surprising, first of all, that multinational companies have qualms about Brexit, and secondly, that at this stage in the negotiations, things feel pretty tricky because, you know, the European Commission has got absolutely no interest at all in saying that these Brexit negotiations are going swimmingly well. Well done, Team Britain, and we're going to have a good deal. They were always going to be saying that this is going to be very, very tricky. That's part of their negotiating tactics. And we have to stand firm in this situation, ignore these siren voices and get on and support Theresa May.
But they're not just siren voices. This is real businesses making real investment decisions right up against it and beginning to feel a bit panicky and very, very worried about the job-creating businesses that they're engaged in. What they want to know is when we write these letters, when we make these comments, does the government actually listen at all? Is there any change of tone or policy? Do you get it at all as a cabinet when business comes to you and says these kind of things?
Well, I think if you look at the approach Theresa May has taken to Brexit so far, what you can see is someone who has the instincts of a Brexiteer, but the cautious pragmatism of a Remainer, which is where I think the British people are. And so what businesses want is stability and certainty, and that's exactly what she has been doing. That's why she negotiated the transition deal, which is the thing that they...
Remainer.
Well, and the instincts of a Brexiteer in terms of wanting to get back control of our destiny. And that combination is where Britain is. But she also brings incredible resilience, and I would say that we just have to allow her to get on and negotiate this deal because she is the best person to do that.
Business which is worried about no deal or worried about a cliff edge, cautious pragmatism, they should be thinking, is what we're going to get from the government.
Cautious pragmatism that delivers what the British people wanted. They wanted control of our borders, our law and our money. This is always going to be a difficult period, but I'm absolutely sure that we will get there in the end.
Let me ask you about the very disturbing story in the Sunday Times today following the big inquiry into all those deaths. These Graysby syringes, there are 40,000 similar syringes being used up and down the NHS right now. What are you going to do about that?
Well, the first thing is that the Sunday Times story says that there is some kind of a cover-up, and I think we should take the word of Bishop James Jones and the panel who did the Gosport inquiry. I mean, this is the man who took on the British establishment with the huge work he did over Hillsborough, and he's absolutely clear that he has looked at everything he wants to look at, and there's absolutely no question of him being constrained in his inquiry. But that is not the same as an issue of dangerous syringes which have been in use across the world. The NHS sent out instructions in 2010.
Australia's banned them, New Zealand have banned them, we're still using 40,000 of them. Does this need another inquiry, another look at these syringes?
Well, the information I have is that these particular syringes were taken out of service in 2015, but of course we will look very, very carefully at this story and indeed look at whether the NHS did react quickly enough when we first found out about the safety consequences of these syringes.
I asked you about business worried about Brexit. There's a huge march in London yesterday, 100,000 people. Is that entirely pointless, or do people like you watch that and have any kind of second thought about where you're going?
We are a democracy and elected politicians listen, and what we have to do in government is to make a judgment as to what the British people actually want. And my judgment, and I know the Prime Minister's judgment, is that they do want us to deliver on that referendum result, but they want it to be done in a sensible way that protects our prosperity as a nation. And that's what Theresa May is getting on and doing.
2 years ago, we were sitting together on these chairs, and you told me that child obesity was a national emergency. Not a great deal has happened since then. Are we finally going to see action rather than endless discussion and deliberation?
Well, a great deal has happened. We've introduced the sugary drinks tax, which has seen around half of manufacturers reformulating their drinks to reduce the sugar content. That's about 45 million kilos of sugar taken off the market. But every parent is worried about this issue, and we have a package of measures today. We're doing for the first time something very bold, which is we're saying we want to halve childhood obesity by 2030.
And can I ask, every restaurant, every snack bar, every sausage vendor, every ice cream van is going to have the calories that are involved visible to customers?
Well, we're going to consult on precisely how small a business you would need to be potentially exempt from that. But certainly all the big chains that we go to, they must give people that information. And we need to change people's understanding, and particularly parents who want to take responsibility, and they need to play their part too.
Jeremy Hunt, thanks very much indeed for talking to us. Now look at what's coming up straight after this programme.
On Sunday Morning Live, as scientists create disease-resistant pigs, we discuss the ethics of gene editing.
And 70 years after the arrival of the Empire Windrush, how have our attitudes to immigration changed?
And why best-selling author Kate Moss had to give up writing. Join us at 10.
That's all for this week. No time for music. Thanks to all my guests. Now, you may be wondering just what the NHS is going to do with all of that money. Next week, I'm going to be talking to Simon Stevens, the NHS Chief Executive, about exactly that. I'll also be joined by the former US Secretary of State, Madeleine Albright, and the former Wimbledon champion, Martina Navratilova. Until then, goodbye.